Now I want to talk about factoring the second type of trinomial. Now you're going to see here that I already made a video for this, but as it turned out I wasn't being careful and some of the things I wrote was off the screen. So instead of actually redoing my work, I'm just going to talk through what I did previously. So I called this Factoring Trinomials Part 2. Now once again, I want to distinguish, this is the first kind of trinomial that we talked about factoring. And the key is there was no number in front of the squared term. Or we call that there is no leading coefficient. And I wrote here, these are actually fairly easy to factor. Now that is compared to the second kind of trinomial, which does in fact have a leading coefficient. So here 2x squared plus 7x plus 6 is what I started with. And we consider that harder to factor. The key is the 2 in front of the squared term. Now with both these kinds of trinomials, the first couple steps are the same. You're going to go calculate your product, which is going to be the number in front of the squared term times the last number. That's going to be your product. And then the sum is going to be the number in front of the middle term. So for this second trinomial, the product was 12, 2 times 6, and you can see the sum is 7. So I went off to the side and I created my product sum table, and I wrote up there I was looking for a product of 12 and a sum of 7. And I can say I'm off the screen again. So what two numbers multiplied together equal 12, and when you add them equal 7, turns out 4 and 3. 4 times 3 is 12, and 4 plus 3 is 7. Now, for the first kind of trinomial, the kind without the coefficient for the squared term, once we find these two factors, we're pretty much done. And that's why we consider them easy. However, for the kind of trinomial we're working with now, where we have a number in front of the squared term, we have a couple more steps. And here's what we have to do. We basically take the original trinomial, and then what you do is you rewrite the first and last term. So in a minute, you're going to see that I go ahead and basically rewrite the 2x squared, and then also you'll see that I also rewrote plus 6. So basically you write the first and last terms again, and then the middle term, 7x, I'm going to split up into two terms, and I'm going to split them up and let those two terms, I'm going to use these factors here of 3 and 4. So what you do is the 7x gets split up into 4x plus 3x. And that 4 and 3 were the two factors from my problem. So that's how you go about starting to factor these kinds of problems. So now we've gone from having 3 terms to 4 terms. And if you remember, whenever we have 4 terms, the way we factor it is to factor by grouping. So we're going to take the first 2 terms, and I'm going to see if there's a GCF. So I have 2x squared plus 4x, and I notice that the GCF is 2x. So I have 2x, and in parentheses x plus 2, And then I look at the 3x plus 6. I see the GCF is 3. So I factor out the 3. And then I have 3 times x plus 2. And now we know the factor by grouping is working because I have identical parentheses here. So you factor out the whole parenthesis, the x plus 2, and then in the second parenthesis you have 2x plus 3. And now we have factored this trinomial. So just to review, when you have a trinomial with a number in front of the squared term, you go find your factors using product sum, but once you find the factors, then you have to sort of rewrite the problem in order to factor it. Now here's a second example I did. 6r squared plus r minus 1. Once again, I have a coefficient for the squared term. So you go ahead and do your product sum. The product is going to be 6 times negative 1 or negative 6. The sum is the coefficient in front of the middle term. Well, there's no number there, although really there's a 1 there. So we say the product is minus 6, and then the sum is 1. And as it turns out, when you work out the product sum, you come up with 3 and minus 2. Because when you multiply 3 and negative 2 together, that equals negative 6. But when you add those numbers together, it equals 1. So then what do? We rewrite the first term and the last term. So in a minute you're going to see I'm going to copy down 6r squared and minus 1. The r, I'm going to break up into 2 terms, and I'm going to use the 3 and the minus 2. So here it is. The 6r squared is written here. The negative 1 is written here. The r is broken up into 3r minus 2r, where the 3 and the minus 2 came from my product sum. Now I have 4 terms, so I do factor by grouping. I notice the first 2 terms, I have a GCF of 3r, so I factor out the 3r, and inside parentheses I have 2r plus 1. And then if I look at the last 2 terms, there's no GCF per se, but I do notice that they're both negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out the negative, or actually I'm going to factor out a negative 1. So you see here, I factor out a negative 1. So therefore, inside the parentheses is 2r plus 1. And now, since I'm doing factor by grouping, I'm happy that I have the identical parenthesis. So you factor out the whole parenthesis, and you end up with 2r plus 1 times 3r minus 1. And now we have factored that trinomial. So now we can factor both kinds of trinomials, whether we have a number in front of the squared term or not.